Video just came out. Why living in Spain has become impossible. I live here. Like, I live here. What's going on?
Living in Spain is worse than you think. 10 years ago, in Barcelona, you could rent an apartment for €650 a month. Today, the price of that same space has nearly doubled. And in Madrid, rents have increased by 20% in a single year alone. This isn't just an outlier happening in the cities, but all across the country. In the last 10 years,
Hold on. So, just all over the world right now, rents are increasing. This isn't just Spain. This isn't just Barcelona.
rents countrywide have doubled, while salaries have increased by just 20%. Today, 1 in 4 families who rent spend more than 40% of their income just on their accommodation. There is a housing crisis, a cost of living crisis, and now even an immigration crisis.
I can definitely agree there is a housing crisis. Me trying to find an apartment here, it was very tough. And there are a lot of immigrants.
But not as you may think. While Spain has seen some of its highest migration levels in history, many people are angry at another group: tourists and wealthy foreigners. In cities like Barcelona, this problem has exploded. 1 in 4 people in the city are now expats, as locals are being priced out or becoming housekeepers in the homes they used to grow up in. All of this while 3.8 million homes, a staggering 14% of Spain's housing stock, sit completely empty. In Barcelona, historic villages, once vibrant and rich centers of culture, have become parodies of themselves.
So I just want to talk about the immigration crisis. I actually know that Spain has the lowest birth rate in Europe. They're on a decline. And I actually had read the other day, Spain is actually depending on immigrants to live here to be able to support their economy, because people just aren't having kids like they used to in Spain anymore. And in order to support the economy, they actually need immigrants. So is this really an immigration crisis?
Century-old shops and traditional businesses have vanished, replaced by souvenir shops selling flamenco dolls and ceramic bulls. The Spanish have had enough. Thousands have taken to the street in protest, writing graffiti, or even attacking tourists, telling them to leave. But these issues are just symptoms of a much bigger problem facing the nation, one which could come to define Spain, and even Europe, for decades to come. The government is desperately trying to make this work, introducing 100% tax for those buying property from outside the EU, and even talking of banning short-term rent.
Spain does love its taxes. I know that much. They love to do taxes for foreigners and for the people that are actually from Spain.
But many fear this is simply too little too late. So how did it get this bad? And can it be saved? This is how living in Spain became impossible. To truly understand how things in Spain got so bad, we only need to go back around 20 years to the beginning of the 2000s, when Spain's modern-day disaster first began to quietly unfold. On the surface, it looked like a golden era. The economy was booming, and the country was riding a wave of prosperity. But beneath it all, the foundations of a future crisis were slowly being laid. After Spain joined the EU, it gained membership of the single currency, and with it came access to the entire European market. Suddenly they had access to a massive wave of foreign investment, cheap credit, and a whole host of new trading partners. But one sector in particular was booming: construction. Thanks to the flood of foreign investment, developers were building more houses than ever before. Between 2000 and 2000,
All this is new to me, so I didn't study that much about that construction back in the day, so I'm learning here as well.
2009, the country built 5 million new homes, increasing the total amount of housing units by 25%. Spain had become the European hotspot for construction. At one point, the country was building more homes than Germany, France, and the UK combined. During this time period, 1 in 5 jobs in the country were in the construction sector, and the for sale sign had become so ubiquitous across Spain that it became known as the country's national tree. And for a while, the country was looking on its up. Spain had a history of high rates of unemployment. For decades, it had been hovering around 20%.
20% unemployment? Jesus.
Thanks to this explosion in construction, the figure had dropped dramatically to just 8%. Bricklayers and electricians were suddenly pulling in serious cash, and in some parts of the country, blue-collar workers were driving around in luxury cars. Even youth unemployment, something which had been hovering around 40% for decades, dropped down to a more manageable 18%. It was a golden age, or at least it looked like one. As is always the case, the booming housing market caught the eye of wealthy foreigners. At the start of the 2000s, 2% of the Spanish population were foreigners, but by 2007, this number had risen to 10%. Many of these newcomers weren't just looking for places to live. They wanted holiday homes, rental resorts, and of course, investments.
I see where this is going right now. So in the past, Spain built a bunch of houses, and then they're looking for people to fill those houses, which attracted newcomers because Spain is so gorgeous. It's on the Mediterranean, and then the tourists started to flood in, and that's where we're going.
Thanks to this, Spanish mortgage debt exploded. In 2000, it stood at 200 million euros, but by 2007, this had increased to over 1 billion. People bought second, third, and even fourth homes just to flip them later for a profit. All this demand made house prices explode. From 2000 to 2007, prices increased by a staggering 200% nationwide. For a while, the system worked. But here's the thing. Because the construction industry was booming, the country's native population was seeing huge increases in their income. In 7 years from 2000, the average Spaniard increased their income by 14%, growing faster than France, Germany, and even the United States. The world looked on in envy, and economists began calling it the Spanish miracle. On top of this explosive income growth, the huge number of houses being built meant that while house prices were rising,
Everything that goes up must come down.
these were mostly being driven by rising prices of luxury tourist homes, and the price of affordable housing, particularly in regions outside of tourist hotspots, remained manageable for native workers. But if history teaches us one lesson, it's that an economy built on debt, combined with the promise of ever-rising prices, is just waiting to collapse. And in 2008, that's exactly what happened. The global financial crisis hit, and the Spanish miracle quickly turned into a nightmare, causing the country's economy to quickly grind to a halt. Overnight, millions of workers lost their jobs. Unemployment soared from 8% to over 20%.
I was a child in school when the 2008 financial crisis hit America. So at the time, I really didn't know how it affected people. But after being older and learning about it, it was a tough time. I actually didn't know that it was global. I had thought it was just my country.
And in a couple short years, the construction industry, once the foundation of Spain's economy, lost 50% of its value, costing the country over 100 billion euros every year. The number of houses being built also plummeted, from over 600,000 annually to barely 30,000. Families who had taken out huge mortgages suddenly couldn't make payments, and homes lost value, jobs vanished, and entire communities were left in ruin. But here's the thing, while the headlines eventually moved on, the crisis never really ended. The crash just didn't leave a temporary dent, it reshaped the Spanish economy, and nearly 2 decades later, the damage is still showing. Since the crash, average incomes in Spain have basically remained stagnant, barely growing 4% over 2 decades. All the while, house prices are showing no signs of slowing. In major cities like Valencia and Barcelona, the cost of renting a small apartment is increasing by upwards of 10% every year. For the average person, living in Spain has never been harder. To understand why things still haven't gone back to normal, we need to look at one of the strangest legacies of the crash. A quiet problem that continues to haunt Spain's housing market to this day: empty homes. After the housing crisis,
Where are these empty homes? He had mentioned this, like this is the third time. So where are these empty homes? Let us know.
there was a massive glut of houses that had been built but weren't sold before the crash, around 600,000. Now, normally you would expect these homes to be sold off in a few years down the line, but by 2022, there were still 450,000 of these homes that had never even been bought, 4 times the amount of homes the country builds every year. This might sound strange considering that the country is in the middle of a housing affordability crisis, but these homes aren't empty because nobody wants them, they're empty because they're unlivable. During the boom, developers built frantically, pushing further from city centres onto cheap, poorly connected land. Entire suburbs were thrown up in remote areas with no infrastructure, under the assumption that cities would eventually expand to meet them. At a time when it seemed like house prices would never stop rising, this didn't seem like such a bad idea. But when the market crashed, that expansion never came. The result is that hundreds of thousands of homes have been fully built but are left abandoned. Here's where things get interesting. These homes aren't just a legacy of past mistakes, they are actively killing Spain's construction industry. With such a massive surplus of unbought homes, developers have been almost entirely put off building new ones. Why would they when there are so many houses that have already been built?
You know what I'm thinking about right now? Probably to solve this. I remember years ago, Italy had did this thing where it's like just €1 for a house, and that attracted a lot of foreigners to come in, buy a €1 house, but obviously they had to have money to come in and fix it up and rehab it, and there were certain criteria that had to be met, like this. So I still haven't seen these empty houses yet in Spain, but I have some digging to do.
But sit empty. From 2003 to 2007, the country was building around 600,000 new homes every year. But since the crisis, they have only built around 80,000 per year. That's the second lowest building rate of any country in Europe, and it's making living in Spain impossible. Thanks to the restricted supply, the price of actually buying a home has exploded. In the last decade,
impossible is such a strong word because there are millions of people currently living here right now. But no, I do get what he's saying. He's hinting at the fact that it's getting very challenging for Spaniards to live here.
house prices have increased by just under 50%, all coming from a time when median incomes haven't increased at all. And for most natives, the dream of owning a home has now become increasingly impossible. But it's not just the lack of new construction that's driving the crisis.
That's actually true. When he says about owning a home, a lot of the people that I talk to here, especially my age, I'm 31, they say that it's impossible to buy a home. Like they don't even have dreams of buying a home. So now I'm kind of relating to what he's saying more on the impossible to buy a home, but it's not impossible to actually live here.
There's another key factor at play. At the same time as home building slowed to a crawl, Spain's population has kept growing. For decades, the country has been suffering from what was once seen as a sign of success: immigration. Back in 1998, immigrants made up just 1.6% of the population. By 2022, that number had soared to nearly 20%, 8.6 million people. And in recent years, population growth has been driven almost entirely by migration. In 2023, migrants accounted
Remember what I said about the birth rate declining in Spain?
for 90% of the country's total population increase. This influx is especially concentrated in major cities like Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia, where rising demand is pushing locals out of their own neighborhoods. But here's the real problem. Many of these newcomers aren't just looking for homes, they're looking for investments. With construction unable to keep up with new demand, Spain's property market looks like a gold mine. Wealthy foreigners see a growing population, booming tourism, and a housing shortage, and they see that prices can only go one way: up. This creates a self-fulfilling cycle, where housing is treated more as an investment than as a basic need. And in the end, it's ordinary Spaniards who are left struggling to find a place they can actually afford to live. In recent years, this has become more than just an issue of affordability. The housing crisis may be killing the country's future prospects. Spain has one of the highest youth unemployment rates in the European Union, sitting at over 27% as of
27%, and I thought 20% was high.
2023, more than double the EU average. It's not because young people aren't looking for work. In fact, many are desperate to find opportunities. But there's a major roadblock standing in their way: housing. Most of the jobs, especially the ones for young professionals, are located in the country's major cities: Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia. But in these cities, housing has become completely unaffordable. An average studio apartment in
That actually does make a lot of sense, because I can't see an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old on a Spanish salary coming here, having an apartment, and actually making a living wage. It has to be very hard to do.
Barcelona now costs upwards of €1,200 every month. With Spain's minimum wage set at 9.26 euros, it would take a month's worth of work just to cover rent. And in theory, you graduate, move to a city, start your career and build a life. But in Spain, that has become nearly impossible. So instead of moving to where the jobs are, they stay at home or leave the country entirely. And that's a huge problem. The future of any economy depends on young people entering the workforce, paying taxes, starting businesses and spending money. And if they can't afford to live in the cities where the economic activity is happening, this simply never happens. The Spanish government...
My thing is, there's so many cities in the world where it is expensive. I think it's just rising inflation throughout the world, not just Spain.
Is finally starting to act, realizing perhaps too late the scale of the crisis that they're in. One of the boldest moves has been a proposed 100% tax on property purchases by non-EU buyers. The idea behind this is simple: discourage foreigners from buying Spanish homes purely as an investment vehicle, freeing up those houses for ordinary people to move into.
Well, I go to Spanish school here, and I do meet a lot of older Americans that have come here and brought apartment in Barcelona, and they won't live here full time. They'll be like back and forth between the States and here. So when I think about it, it's like their apartment, which is not being used, that could be for an actual Spaniard, someone, 18 to 20 coming here to make a living.
And in theory, this should bring prices back down. But there is a problem. For all the damage foreign investment has done, it's also one of the few things still motivating developers to build. If that money disappears overnight, it could remove the last remaining incentive to construct new housing, making supply even tighter. And yet, even if the plan does work, it may be too little too late. Years of inaction have brought the country to a breaking point. Tens of thousands of Spaniards are already being priced out, and young people are being locked out of the cities where they might have built their futures, and the economic consequences are starting to pile up. Spain's current crisis is a result of years of short-term thinking, market speculation and political inaction. What began as an economic boom has slowly turned into an affordability crisis. Recent proposals show that policymakers are starting to take this issue more seriously, but the scale of the...
Were they never not taking it seriously? Has the Spanish government just kind of blown this off?
problem is massive, and fixing it will take more than taxes and restrictions. It will require sustained investment, smarter urban planning, and policies that treat housing as a necessity and not just an asset. That kind of foresight is exactly what's happening now in an entirely different space, especially with metals like copper. Now, it may not sound connected, but copper is essential to modern life, and it powers homes, cities, transport, and infrastructure. And just like housing in Spain, global supply hasn't kept up with demand. Now, the US government is treating copper not just as a resource, but as a strategic priority.
Copper is a critical material, and the supply of copper is vital to our national security.
Everyone needs new houses, and with demand surging and global mine production set to peak by 2026, the US is staring down a 700,000-ton copper
Hashtag make Spain great again.
deficit, which is why bold executive orders are being signed to boost domestic mining.
Tariffs will help rebuild back our American copper industry and strengthen our national defense, and they should be made in America.
Meanwhile, China, responsible for over 50% of global smelting, is facing mounting export issues. The world is hungry for copper, and America is finally acting. Giant Mining, ticker BFGFF, is the sponsor of today's video. Not only does it own and operate a copper-silver gold 424213 was issued and implicitly prioritizes copper as a critical resource. Nevada, where Giant Mining's copper project is situated, has constant opportunities,
Where is he going with all this copper? Let's wrap it up. Where are you going?
which in my view is great news. The share price is down by 50% since early February due to market turmoil, so I'm highlighting the company to you today for a reason. Giant Mining owns the Majuba Hill copper project, which is a past producing mine, and in the past 4 years, management and the company's geologists have actually expanded the copper deposit, and this past September, Giant Mining hit their best ever drill hole. Historic underground mines at the Majuba Hill project produced copper, tin and silver from the early 1900s to the 1950s, including 2.8 million pounds of copper, 140,000 ounces of silver, 5,800 ounces of gold and 21,000 pounds of tin. I will say this again, All of these factors, and the following ones below, are the ones that led to my significantly bullish opinion about giant mining.
All right, that just seemed like an ad. I have no idea why he put that in the video. But why living in Spain has become impossible. Do I think it's impossible? Obviously, everything is possible, and there are people that are still living here. So you can live in Spain. He did help put things in perspective for me, especially when he kind of went back talking about the construction and then the 2008 housing crisis here and just how everything kind of adds up. But like I said before, I do think just around the world, inflation is hit. Even in my country, even in America, a lot of people in my age group say that it is very difficult to buy a house. I actually am very blessed. I was able to buy a house in America, what was it, like two years ago now. But for a lot of people, it just seems out of reach.